Here, and I'm sure we're up for a great talk about how cities are changing. And this particular case is, most interesting because of the mix of Latinos and how Puerto Ricans and Dominicans have interacted and what they have done in the city. But I want to leave you with Llana Barber from SUNY Old Westbury, and Cecilia Marquez from MLU, who's going to be the commentator on that. We have two experts on the topic, and hopefully we'll have a good discussion at the end. So when you guys are going to introduce each other, I understood. So I'm going to leave it at that. Just wanted to welcome you. Thank you for doing this, and welcome you all. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that introduction. Yes, what the format we are hoping to do, if it's okay with everyone here, is I'll give an overview of the book, and then Cecilia Marquez has been generous enough to agree to give some comments on the book and ask some beginning questions, and then we can open it up to questions after that. My name is Llana Barber. I'm from the State University of New York at Old Westbury, and I'm very, very grateful to be here. It's tremendously exciting. Both Centro and the Dominican Studies Institute have been absolutely essential to pioneering studies of Dominicans and Puerto Ricans in diaspora. So it's a privilege to be able to be at an event that they have co-sponsored. So thank you so much for everyone who put this together. So the book is a history of Lawrence, Massachusetts from the post-war era until 2000. In the year 2000, Lawrence became the first Latino-majority city in New England, and it's today approximately 75% Latino, mostly Dominican and Puerto Rican. It's the largest concentration of Dominicans outside of New York City. At the same time with that 2000 census, Lawrence also became the poorest city in the state of Massachusetts, officially, and one of the poorest cities in the nation. So ultimately, what I was trying to do in this history was put those two dynamics in conversation with one another. How is it that Lawrence went through such a period of economic crisis, economic decline, blight, deindustrialization, fiscal crisis, and yet at the same time became such a major settlement site for tens of thousands of Dominicans and Puerto Ricans? Why Lawrence? To me, it challenged many of the major immigration, migration narratives that people go where there are job opportunities. But Lawrence, in the major period of Latino settlement, had nearly a 25% Latino unemployment rate. So clearly, if we want to understand why so many Dominicans and Puerto Ricans settled in Lawrence, we need to look beyond this basic jobs, people follow the jobs, where are the jobs narrative. Not that employment isn't important, but that it doesn't fully capture the range of human experiences when people are trying to decide where they're going to live, where they're going to settle, where they're going to raise their families. So the book ultimately tries to tie together, braid together three different aspects of this past. One, the story of urban crisis, as you can see in the title. Urban crisis is kind of a summary term that historians use to describe the impact on urban economies and societies in the era from like the 1960s to the early 1990s. And what happened in this era was in many cities, particularly in the Northeast and the Midwest and what we would call the Rust Belt, cities went through a dramatic, profound economic decline. This decline was partially the result of deindustrialization, of manufacturing moving to the south and then overseas, but it was also, historians emphasize, really about the impact of suburbanization on urban economies. And that became very obvious in Lawrence. At the same time that Lawrence was losing tremendous portions of its white population, Lawrence lost approximately 40% of its white residents between 1940 and 1980. So at the same time that Lawrence was losing its white residents, at the same time that Lawrence was losing its industry, its manufacturing, that the mills were closing, at the same time that Lawrence was losing its retail establishments, the stores in downtown were shuttering, at the same time that Lawrence was effectively losing its tax base and thus losing the funding for its education services, its public safety services, at the same time that Lawrence was losing all of this, its suburbs were growing. dramatically in population, in wealth, in industry, in manufacturing, right? We think of deindustrialization as being a flight of manufacturing overseas or to the south, but the reality is that Lawrence's suburban neighbor, Andover, became the major manufacturing hub in the region in the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s, particularly with Raytheon, the defense contractor, becoming the major industrial employer in the region. So at the same time, and of course, in the era of suburban growth, the new retail hubs shifted from being urban downtowns to suburban malls. So at the same time that Lawrence was going through this period of economic crisis, the suburbs around it were booming. The suburbs around it were flourishing and prospering. And yet the suburbs were very strategically, in Lawrence as in the entire nation effectively, the suburbs were being very strategic in ensuring that their growth was limited to a specific class and a specific racial segment of the population. So suburban growth really, both in Lawrence's suburbs and in the nation at large, represented a form of white flight and represented a form of white prosperity that the Dominicans and Puerto Ricans who came to settle in Lawrence were largely cut off from. So that's one of the threads that I'm trying to weave together in the book. The second thread I'm trying to weave together is this narrative, the other most important thing that happened in the late 20th century, aside from urban crisis, the other important thing that happened is the immigration of millions, tens of millions of people from Latin America. So to me, the question of how do these two stories fit together is absolutely what I'm trying to answer in my work. I chose to write about Lawrence because I believe that Lawrence showed us how these stories fit together. How does the story of suburbanization's impact on urban economies tie together with the story of Latino immigration? And one of the things that I emphasize in this book, that if, following Juan Gonzalez and Harvest of Empire, that if you really want to understand why so many Dominicans and Puerto Ricans ended up in Lawrence, you need to understand what pushed them from the Dominican Republic and from Puerto Rico. And particularly many of the early settlers in Lawrence first lived in New York City. So you also need to understand what pushed people out of New York City, particularly in the 1970s. And so ultimately, that question of why did so many Dominicans and Puerto Ricans settle in Lawrence is also a question of why did so many Dominicans and Puerto Ricans feel like they had to leave their homes, because really very few people want to pick up and migrate. That impulse to go search for a better life elsewhere only happens when those opportunities for a better life are foreclosed at home. So I argue that if you truly want to understand Dominican and Puerto Rican migration, you have to consider them not immigrants, clearly, because Puerto Ricans are U.S. citizens already, but even for Dominicans, both Dominicans and Puerto Ricans really are moving as a result of the long history of U.S. intervention in the Caribbean. And so they're moving from one part of the American empire to another part of the American empire. They are, in that respect, imperial migrants. One of the Dominicans in Lawrence said, "You want to know why there's so many Dominicans here in Lawrence? It's because the United States has taken all the wealth of our country." Right? So there was a clear articulation among the people who I was interviewing and writing about, and whose interviews I was reading, that this idea of movement to Lawrence was not this typical immigrant narrative of moving to opportunity. It was a very colonialist narrative, or anti-colonialist narrative, of we have been displaced and we came to Lawrence because what we were looking for, the opportunities we were looking for, did not exist in Puerto Rico, did not exist in the Dominican Republic because of the long history of U.S. intervention there. So ultimately, this question of why did so many Dominicans and Puerto Ricans settle in Lawrence is a question of imperial migration, and it is the end story, the final scene in the history of American empire and American imperial interventions in the Caribbean. So those are the two, right? We've got suburbanization and urban crisis being one of the major threads I'm trying to weave together with the history of Dominican and Puerto Rican imperial migrants. And then the third aspect that I was trying to weave together in this story was the story of Dominican and Puerto Rican activism. Because the reality was that as Lawrence was going through such an economic crisis, as the city itself was in many ways, in terms of its built environment, in terms of its school system, in terms of its public safety, in terms of its ability to keep the sanitation services, as Lawrence was going through such an economic decline, for many of the white residents who stayed, who were not able to leave to the suburbs, they looked around at the city they knew as it was collapsing around them, and they said, well, we know why our city is suffering. We know why our city is poor. It's because all these Spanish people have brought poverty here. And the level of scapegoating that happened in Lawrence was really shocking. And I say that not out of a place of naivete, because who would scapegoat, right? I say that because the clear, outspoken, virulent bigotry that met many Dominicans and Puerto Ricans in Lawrence was really, at that time, already beyond the pale in most of liberal Massachusetts. To the extent that in 1984, white residents and Latino and mainly Puerto Rican, but other Latin American immigrants as well, other Latin American migrants as well, right, if I'm going to stay with this imperial migrant frame, faced off in the street in a series of race riots where white Americans chanted, USA, USA, who's American, we're American, go back where you came from, right? The level of virulent, in the early 1990s, little handmade Spicks Go Home signs being posted in people's windows, a level of stores in the 1970s being closed with signs that said, this store closed to all Puerto Ricans and all their bum friends, right? A level of virulent and explicit bigotry met many Dominicans and Puerto Ricans who tried to settle in Lawrence. So how then do you settle in a city with very little economic opportunity, with incredible bigotry from many of your white neighbors, and with explicit marginalization from the political structure until at least the 1990s? How do you settle in a city that is so persuaded that the only hope for a renaissance that it has is if it can convince you to go home, right? And in that context, the way that people settled was they organized. The way that they settled was they fought, both in the riot, both in daily acts of, quote, resistance, daily acts of insisting on their right to be there, daily acts of organizing cultural celebrations, organizing immigrant settlement services, organizing an array of anti-discrimination organizations. There's too many organizings in that word, in that sentence, forgive me. But they organized effectively to insist on their right to stay in Lawrence. And so that is the other third major thrust of the book that I'm trying to braid together, is how Puerto Rican and Dominican settlement in Lawrence required tremendous activism, that this transition, as most transitions to a Latino-majority city, was not simply a demographic change. It was the result of Puerto Ricans and Dominicans actively claiming the city and insisting on their right to the city, their right to be at home and build community and have, ultimately, political power in the city. And that is what ended up happening, that over time, as a result of this activism, Dominican and Puerto Rican settlement in Lawrence absolutely reinvigorated the city. They provided an economic backbone to the city. They ultimately wound up having tremendous political power within the city. And yet, in the context of urban crisis, suburbanization, the city itself wound up still being economically marginal in the region. So this winds up being the saddest part of the story to me, in spite of the fact that this is really a history, to some extent, of Dominicans and Puerto Ricans saving Lawrence and revitalizing Lawrence. As one activist said, if we were to leave the city, this would be a ghost town. So even though this is a story of Dominicans and Puerto Ricans saving the city, it's also a story of the way in which urban economic decline and ultimately segregation within an area of concentrated poverty limited and restricted Dominican and Puerto Rican opportunities within the city of Lawrence. That this is really ultimately a story of searching for better opportunities, but having access to those better opportunities restricted because of the racialized political economy of urban disinvestment during the urban crisis era. Okay, so that's the summary.
Okay. I am not nearly as extemporaneous. I'm going to be like an academic and read a little bit to you. But before, I'm Cecilia Marquez. I am an assistant professor at New York University in the Department of Social and Cultural Analysis, where I teach Latino studies. My degree is in history, so I'm a historian by training. And I should say I write about the South. I write about the history of Latinos in the U.S. South. So I am distinctly not someone who knows a lot about the Northeast and not someone who knows a lot about cities. So this is, I mean, I was sort of learned through the process, but it's been very, it's been great to get to read this book and sort of like acquaint myself in some ways with urban studies through Lawrence. And I think being in New York has been a quick introduction to Puerto Rican history, Dominican history, and urban history that is sort of saturated in the city, and I learned a lot of it very quickly. But so I feel very lucky to get to be here in El Centro with the Dominican Studies Institute and commenting on Llana's book. Okay, so I first read this book when I assigned part of it for my Introduction to Latino Studies class, and I thought it might be helpful to talk a little bit about why I think it's useful in that class, because I think it gets at some of the big contributions of the book, and then I'm going to ask a couple questions for Llana. So I want to start by just really praising the book. I think it's an amazing accomplishment. I think it reveals that, I think that the depths of Llana's research are revealed in the sort of rich, multifaceted account of Lawrence. We really get a sense of Lawrence as a character in the story, right? The city really comes alive in a way that I think is evidence of a sort of a deep archival engagement with the space. She beautifully weaves together imperial, national, and local stories to demonstrate the tangled web in which many Puerto Ricans and Dominicans found themselves ensnared. American exploits often pushed what Llana calls imperial migrants to the United States. And I think that this categorization of imperial migrants is really helpful for framing the way that those of us in Latino studies think about migration. So drawing on Juan Gonzalez's legacy of Harvest of Empire, Llana's Latino City highlights the push rather than the pull factors behind migration and the heavy role that U.S. interests played in the production of these migration streams. In Lawrence, Llana really draws out a microcosm of a migration pattern that has been replicated in many places throughout the globe. And I think that this is a really powerful part of the book. I think I spent a lot of time in Intro to Latino Studies trying to disabuse my students of the American dream narrative of migration, which is really important to them and really important to a lot of their parents about the reasons that they come to the United States and to the sort of success in those things, and trying to have them think critically about why people are drawn to the United States and what the role of U.S. intervention is. And I think this framing of imperial migrants and thinking about the sort of expansive nature of American empire is sort of powerful for undergrads. And powerful for Latino studies more broadly, but I think them learning that was really, it was great to see how that played out. The other thing I love about this book is that I think it's a fresh take on questions of Latinos and urbanity. Placing Latinos at the center of the story of urban crisis, Llana demonstrates the important role that migration played in often mitigating some of the worst effects of urban crisis by infusing declining communities with new populations eager to work and invest in community institutions. She also both reperiodizes a long urban crisis, so she sort of argues that it spans from the 1930s through the 1990s, which is a new periodization that I think only when you're sort of situating Latinos at the center that you get to see, and adds smaller cities to those among the affected during this period. So she's really expanding what urban crisis is and what is the terrain of urban studies, basically. There's a lot to love about this book, I think, for teaching in an intro class, teaching in New York City. There's a real sort of obsession, I think, with urbanity, which was admittedly a little strange to me coming from Central Virginia. I hadn't, urban studies, it doesn't sort of like mean the same thing in Charlottesville, Virginia as it does in New York City, as you might imagine. But I think what I think this book really does is open up a space for a broader understanding of what is urban and who is affected by these major sea changes that urban centers saw in the late 20th century. Finally, I think that it helps students conceptualize resistance in the context of the seemingly crushing power of American capital. For those of us who are teaching Latino history, Latino studies, I feel like there's this often kind of push and pull with students where I'm like constantly being like, yes, and then American empire wins again, and American empire wins again, and also trying to at the same time hold that there's this constant resistance and there's this constant pushback and there's this constant effort at making home in all of these spaces. This book is framed by American intervention in Latin America as well as by urban decline in the United States at the time. However, while it concedes that these factors produce a world for Latino Lawrencians that is filled with disappointment, it also offers forms of resistance to these forces. While white neighbors claimed that Puerto Rican and Dominican Lawrencians, is it Lawrencians? Am I making that up?
Laurentians, but you can say
Laurentians, okay.
Laurentians.
I'm
I
just rolling.
usually pronounce it Laurentians, but
Great.
I'm probably wrong.
I'm gonna try and talk like a local. Laurentians. Puerto Rican and Dominican Laurentians were the illegitimate heirs to U.S. prosperity. While they argue that they were the illegitimate heirs to U.S. prosperity, organizing and ultimately rioting in 1984 represents some of the ways Latino Laurentians fought back and made Lawrence theirs. This focus on political organizing that was at times unruly and often a rejection of respectability politics helps expand our understanding of Latino politics. Latino organizing, both historically and contemporarily, has struggled to escape from the political bind of framing ourselves as good and deserving immigrants, thereby leaving many of our community members behind. Lawrence offers one model that rejects the need to prove oneself as more deserving or more worthy of the American dream. So now I'm going to ask a couple questions, one of which is about method and framing. We've had this conversation before, but I want to have it again because I think rereading the work I was struck by both the potential and the shortcomings of the term Latino and the category of Latino and trying to like hold the story. In many ways, I think you could say Caribbean city, right? Like it's sort of interesting to think about what work Latino is doing in Latino city. So I'm curious if you could talk more about what it meant to write a text about a Latino city and how you balance both the specificity of the Dominican and Puerto Rican experience in the Northeast with this sort of pan-ethnic categorization of Latino. And of course I know that some of that categorization is you responding to your subjects, right? They're organizing in ways that sort of signal a desire for pan-ethnicity. But I wonder if you could say more about what it meant to sort of write about a Latino city and what, for example, Lawrence shares or departs from the other places we might think of as more traditional Latino cities like Chicago, Miami, New York City. How is it different than those cities? What does it do? How does it challenge our narratives of those kinds of cities? And on a related note, I wonder how specific the story is even to Latinos. I think that you do a really wonderful job of drawing out the imperial histories that drew, or rather pushed migrants to Lawrence, and how that combined with urban decline produced these failures of the American dream. You mentioned briefly, but don't really elaborate on how this might be applicable to refugees more broadly. For example, is the experience of Vietnamese refugees in comparable locations similar to that of Latinos in Lawrence? So just to sort of say, like, how much is this a specifically Latino story? And I know this is a very unfair question because I'm asking you to know like the history of a whole nother population in a whole nother place. But I think I only ask it to underscore what I think is the big contribution, or major contribution of this work, that this concept of imperial migration and the reactionary climate that many experienced upon arrival to the US extends far beyond the Latino city. I wonder if there are takeaways from this book that you think can be applied more broadly to questions of migration, refugee status, and movement outside of a specifically Latino context. My second question is broadly about Blackness and Afro-Latinidad. So I'm curious how race within the Latino community was transformed, how it transformed their organizing. How did Dominicans and Puerto Ricans deal with the sort of real racial differences within their communities? Were alliances made or avoided with African Americans as a result of these racial politics? And that sort of brings me to my next question, which is about relationships with African Americans. So Natalia Molina, whose book, How Race is Made, has talked a lot about race as this relational concept, focusing on how Latinos have been historically racialized in triangulation with other racial and ethnic groups. And in your book, you note that the tight link between Latinos and the inner city resulted in the mapping of anti-Black narratives of criminality and blight onto Latinos. So I wanted to know if there were other ways in which the racial position of Latinos in Lawrence were shaped by Blackness and anti-Blackness in the area, and how the scripts about Latinos were overlapping and how they were distinct from those of African Americans. I have more questions, but I'm gonna pause for now and let you answer them so we can open it up, but I will.
Before you open it up, can I add a question? And the first question that she asked, I also curious about the inter-ethnic, meaning Dominican, Puerto Rican conflicts, if and when they happened, and how they mitigated that or mediated that. You know, I assume it's related to the triangulation of external forces and what have you, but if I recall, there were conflicts there, at least when I was living nearby. So I just wanted to add that.
Yeah. Thank you for those beautiful comments and also for all the questions. And I hope to answer them without taking up the rest of the time so that we can open it up to your questions as well and maybe have a conversation about that. Okay, so let me go back. So first, unfortunately, one of the hardest parts of writing on a very small city, Lawrence has never had more than 100,000 residents, and writing about a city that has suffered from fiscal crisis through the entire period that I'm writing about, is that much of the archive has not been preserved. When I first started writing on this project, I went to Lawrence and I went to City Hall and I was like, so where are the mayor's records archive? And they're like, oh, they take those home. Okay.
Oh. Wow.
So ultimately, I wound up this research. There were so many questions that I wanted to ask the city effectively, that I wanted to ask people who lived in the city through this era, that I wasn't able to directly ask of the archive. I made extensive use of oral history interviews, I conducted oral history interviews, but as anyone who's done oral history interviews knows, when you're trying to get at when you're asking about an event or a movement or an organization, you can get very specific answers. But if you ask, so tell me about the 70s, right? It's a little bit harder to really capture the type of things I was looking for through oral history interviews. So there's a lot of questions that you have that I also have and had and was simply not able to answer for lack of access to relevant archives. And I really hope that one of the things that this book does is encourage more of an archival effort in the city of Lawrence. There are some wonderful people working there, but there are also a lot of activists who have all their records in an attic or in their office and just haven't given them to the archives in the city, to the library or to Lawrence History Center to be preserved, because I really think there's so much more that could be written with so much more nuance than I have been able to do in this book. So specifically though, this idea of Latinidad, this idea of a pan-ethnic framework really absolutely emerged from my experiences being in the city and from the archive itself, that as much as individual people identified more often as Dominican or as Puerto Rican, or there are tremendous other Latin American nationalities that call Lawrence home. As much as people's identity still was often within a national origin framework, their organizing, their actual political organizing and community organizing was often in a pan-ethnic framework. So you had, for example, the Alliance of Latins for Progress and Equality in the 1970s. You had the major community celebration, annual community celebration is Semana Hispana, right? That is actively embracing a pan-ethnic label to try to highlight commonalities. Now, of course, people were attempting to carve out a Latinidad that didn't collapse national differences, but certainly trying to point out both commonalities that Dominicans and Puerto Ricans and other Latinos shared, and also commonalities in their positioning relative to the city's power structure and relative to racism within the city. Ultimately, the city created a racial hierarchy in which Puerto Ricans and Dominicans, for all their differences, found themselves in a very similar position. And in an effort to change that position, this pan-ethnic identity emerged as an organizing strategy. So yes, to answer your question, there absolutely was plenty of tension between Dominicans and Puerto Ricans within the city, and there was plenty of criticism of the fact that when the city began to open up to having some Latino participation in appointed or ultimately elected officials, they tended to appoint people who were neither Dominican nor Puerto Rican, who were safe nationalities outside of the two dominant groups, right? And so there absolutely was tension, and yet for a lot of organizers, and again, this book is a history of activism in many ways, and so that the story that organizers and activists put forward is the one I privileged. In the minds of many organizers, those differences were overblown because those differences were often used by city elites, used by the power structure to justify Latino exclusion. Well, the reason why there are no Latinos in office is because, they can't get together and decide who they want their leaders to be, right? This narrative of Latinos are so divided, that's why they don't have political power, because they can't even get along amongst themselves. And so activists really challenged that narrative and said, no, actually, these divisions are ways in which the city is trying to justify our exclusion and our marginalization. Really, we are speaking with a united voice on certain key things like anti-discrimination, improved schools, access to voting rights, access to public space, use of the common. We are speaking with a common voice in terms of our desire to gain access to these things. And in the moments where the city where city elites would say prejudiced things, like a school committee official who said that the U.S. introduced Puerto Ricans to shoes, if I'm remembering the exact quote correctly. I might be misquoting it. I'll have to look back later on during the questions. But ultimately, that was a time when Latinos in the city banded together in response to this blatant bigotry coming from a city official, right? That the experience of anti-Latino racism really shaped pan-ethnic identity as an organizing strategy, effectively, is what I found. But again, with deeper archives, perhaps a more nuanced answer, I'm sure a more nuanced answer would be available. In terms of whether or not this is specific to Latinos, I'm so glad you asked that, because this is actually one of my favorite things to talk about, or one of the things that now, since the work has been out, has been most interesting for me to have conversations about. Because ultimately, I came to this topic, I lived in Lawrence, I spent time in Lawrence, but as a graduate student, I was studying Black urban history. I was studying the impact of suburbanization on urban economies in Detroit, in Newark, right? I was studying the way in which the urban crisis was in many ways the defining African-American urban experience of the second half of the 20th century. And so when I started to write this book, part of what motivated me was the realization that, my goodness, Lawrence at the time was 99% white in the post-war decades. There was no substantial community of color from which to flee, and yet there was still white flight. And so it was remarkable to me to realize that these national transformations that were happening, the government's investment in suburbia, private investment, private developers' investment in suburbia, the creation of the highway system, the federal emphasis on decentralization, the cultural celebration of the dream of homeownership and the white picket fence that caused suburbia to boom in the post-war decades. These national transformations of suburban exclusivity and suburban prosperity were very powerful. They were very powerful in creating overwhelmingly white and profoundly prosperous suburbs that excluded working class communities of color. They were very powerful whether they were formed. These suburbs were the exclusivity and prosperity and power, political power of these suburbs were very powerful whether or not white people were fleeing Black communities or whether they were just fleeing towards the opportunity that suburban life represented. And so these larger transformations that happened nationally that were very racialized in their national origins. White flight, as historians have amply documented, was an effort to escape from integrating cities out to homogeneous, segregated suburban spaces. This was a national transformation aimed at containing Black communities and Black protests into inner cities, into urban areas. And what was shocking to me was to realize that this happened even where there weren't black communities from which to flee. That the same metropolitan political economy that encouraged suburban prosperity and suburban exclusivity and suburban political power from the 1960s through the 1990s happened nationally. And so if you were a working class or poor refugee or immigrant in the 80s and the early 1990s, if you were an immigrant of color in the urban crisis era, your experience of the American dream, your experience of American opportunity was going to be channeled through the reality of urban crisis. And this is absolutely true whether for many Cambodian refugees, as Eric Tang has documented in his study of called Unsettled. I'm not sure if people are familiar with that, but absolutely it's true for other immigrants from the Caribbean, right? This is absolutely true. If you had resources, suburbia could open its doors for you by the 1980s and 1990s, right? But if you were a poor or working class immigrant of color in the urban crisis era, this spatialized, segregated concentration of poverty was going to be applicable. And so it was a structure that was a geography and a political economy that was designed to contain and ultimately to undermine black communities and black protest, and yet it ultimately shaped the experiences of working class and poor refugees and immigrants from around the world, if they were of color, if they were racialized as non-white, and if they didn't have access to the suburbs in the crisis era, then this crisis experience was for many people determinative. And so all that question to me really, a lot of people when they talk about the growing field of Latino urban studies, talk about moving beyond black and white. Mm-hmm. And yet I don't see this work in any way as somewhere beyond a study of black urban history, because ultimately this book shows the power of anti-black racism to shape the entire geography and the entire economics of the post-war era. This shows the power of anti-black spatialized racism and the power of spatialized white privilege in suburban prosperity to shape experiences even for people who are not African Americans. And so it's not beyond black and white. To some extent, it is a deeper journey into the most important story of the late 20th century, which is, in my opinion, how the entire nation rearranged itself to contain black protest in the late 20th century. So, if I got all your questions. Oh, in terms of the role of blackness. There we go. I'm just rewinding your questions in my head. And so a place where that's particularly visible in Lawrence is in the movement towards welfare reform. That Dominicans and Puerto Ricans in the city of Lawrence were stigmatized, like African Americans were stigmatized in this era, as welfare abusers, as undeserving poor, as people who were illegitimately soaking up the resources from tax-paying Americans. And the idea of welfare abuse and welfare fraud, the idea that Lawrence was a welfare magnet in the terms that they used, that was actively drawing people in just for the presumably generous social services that were provided. They were not that generous, let's be clear. This idea that Lawrence was a welfare magnet ultimately provided the grounds, the rhetorical, the discursive power for the Massachusetts movement to end welfare as we know it. And the Massachusetts welfare reform laws, the highly punitive welfare reform laws that were passed in 1995, went on to be the model for the national reform that was passed in 1996 that ended welfare as we know it. So we see an entire conservative, what many scholars have called a suburban political agenda, to try to stop funding poverty programs or welfare programs based on the idea that these programs benefited the urban poor, distinctly the urban poor, these inner city welfare abusers, welfare queens who were taking money away from tax-paying citizens. That discourse, which we are familiar with as generally being an anti-African American discourse, in Massachusetts was profoundly an anti-Latino discourse and was tied to the fears of Dominican and Puerto Rican welfare users. So, which brings us back to your original question of how is the story of Lawrence different than a typical Latino story? Because of course, the vast majority of Latinos in the U.S. are Mexican, and that is, there are a few Mexicans in Lawrence, but that's not the real dominant story here. And absolutely, these ideas of Latinos triangulating, or Latinos occupying a middle place between white and black, are often fleshed out with Mexican Americans and Chicanos as their example. And the reality is that not only were Puerto Ricans far more segregated from non-Hispanic whites during this era than any other Latino group, but Latinos in Massachusetts were actually far more segregated than other Latinos. They were the poverty levels, but in the 1980s and early 1990s for Latinos in Massachusetts were far higher than other Latinos, even though their education levels were often higher. The concentration in Massachusetts, in New England, of Dominicans and Puerto Ricans into these deteriorating, deindustrializing old mill cities, and their segregation within these areas of real concentrated, spatialized poverty had a tremendous impact on people's experiences. Again, Lawrence did not have a substantial African American population to triangulate from. And yet, the narratives of anti-black racism, the geography of anti-black racism really positioned Dominicans and Puerto Ricans, regardless of their skin color, if they were considered to be urban, inner city Latinos, it positioned them in a way that is really resembles the experience of African Americans with the urban crisis. So in terms of your question of how did Dominicans and Puerto Ricans in Lawrence relate to blackness and whether there were racial divisions within Dominicans and Puerto Ricans, that is a fantastic question that, again, the archive really didn't give any answers to in that. It's something that I hope there is more work as we move forward on. All right, well, I will stop talking for a second and let other people talk and ask questions or give comments. I'm happy to hear it. Are there questions? Yeah, hi.
I had missed the first 15 pages, but what time frame does your book speak to?
Good, yeah, so the book is fully from 1945, the end of World War II, until 2000, when Lawrence becomes a Latino-majority city officially. But the focus of the book is really on the 80s and the early 90s, some of the 70s as well. And really, I periodize the urban crisis as being from the mid-1960s to the early 1990s.
And as far as you know, when did you see a spike in the population of Caribbean peoples?
Yeah, so there were a few Cubans, Puerto Ricans, Dominicans in the city in the late 1950s and the 1960s, but really Lawrence didn't begin to develop this substantial Dominican and Puerto Rican population until the 1970s and 1980s. And the 1970s, many of the people who were moving to Lawrence were moving from New York, and they were really responding to the urban crisis that was occurring in New York City in the 1970s. As New York was going through its own waves of white flight, New York lost 2 million white residents between 1940 and 1970. As it was going through its own deindustrialization, I believe New York lost 100,000 manufacturing jobs each year from 1970 to 1975. And as a result of this widespread deindustrialization and fiscal crisis, there was a rise in crime, a decline in the schools, and Puerto Ricans and Dominicans chose Lawrence because they believed it was going to be escape from urban crisis. It was a place over and over again that people said it was safer, it was quieter, it was
They
a
were
better
the
place
white
to raise
flag.
my children. I'm sorry?
They were the white flag.
To some extent, well, that's a great question, you know, because ultimately, I'm sorry, I'm sitting back and moving away from the microphone. Ultimately, New York in the state of crisis, most people, I mean, there were lots of polls done that most people considered the city unsafe and wanted to leave. And yet, the options to move to the suburbs around New York City were profoundly restricted based on race and class. And so if you didn't have the resources to suburbanize, going to one of these small second-tier cities was a way to escape from New York, and if you didn't have the means to move to the suburbs. There was a great Centro study, I'm not sure if anyone here worked on it, that came out in the early 2000s about looking at the dispersal of Puerto Ricans specifically from New York City between 1995 and 2000. Because of course, in the 1940s, the 88% of Puerto Ricans stateside lived in New York City, but by 2000, only about a quarter did. So there's a massive dispersion of Puerto Ricans from New York City. And of course, some people went to the suburbs, some people went to Florida, but the researchers looked specifically at people who went to small cities in the Northeast and what their income levels were, what their poverty levels were, what their English language abilities were. And overwhelmingly, the people who went to these smaller cities in the Northeast were a category that the Centro researchers termed the displaced. They were people who were being pushed out of New York City by that era by gentrification, not crisis, but pushed out of New York City, but still couldn't they didn't have the class resources or the racial resources to access the suburbs. And so they were concentrating in these small cities in the Northeast, and it did not represent, that spatial mobility didn't represent any type of social mobility. They weren't experiencing any improved circumstances by moving. On the contrary, these cities didn't actually provide any real opportunities, not in terms of economic opportunities, nor in terms of educational opportunities.
So they just put their finger on a map.
Well, no. So thank you for these great questions. They didn't necessarily just put their fingers on the map. Initially, in that early wave of migration to Lawrence, there was still some industry there. And so the remaining industries, as much of manufacturing was relocating itself to Puerto Rico and then Dominican Republic or overseas, there were manufacturers in Lawrence that were actively recruiting Latinos to come and work in these mills as a way to remain competitive with their offshore competitor. But then Lawrence went through a second wave of deindustrialization in the late 1970s and early 1980s, where those remaining mills basically shut down and collapsed. And so at that point, there were no economic opportunities, but because the migration had already started, what was there were people's families. Right? And so the continued migration to that area was partly about being pushed out of other places. It was partially about constrained access to the suburbs and to other areas, but it was also partly about reuniting and reconnecting family networks. Estimates are from between 50 and 70% of the Dominicans in Lawrence are from one specific town, Tenares, in Dominican Republic, right? So we know that communities reconstitute themselves even because people are looking for a better life, not just a job opportunity. And so if a better life means hopefully being able to rebuild your family, your neighborhood, your community in the place that you're settling. And because Lawrence has not had substantial gentrification or any kind of displacement, it is a place that you can rebuild.
I'm going to ask you, Carlos Vargas, one of the researchers here at Centro, and even though I didn't work specifically on that brief, that has been a question that has been motivating a lot of our research. So I am going to ask you to dwell a little bit more on this, because it's still for us a puzzle. Usually when we talk about push and pull factors, I'm glad you mentioned recruitment, because recruitment is not always mentioned. Oh, no, the U.S. is not an opportunity, but people just choose to go somewhere without really abounding into the fact that many of them are asked to come. I understand why people who are working in the textile industry in New York City, as it was declining, might have moved to Lawrence. But why did Puerto Ricans and Dominicans continue to move to Lawrence in the 80s, in the 90s, when it was already a city in crisis? And perhaps Lawrence as an example, a model to explain why Puerto Ricans and Dominicans would go to any post-industrial city, small size, in the Northeast, as opposed to going to where most people at the time are going to, the Sun Belt?
Yeah. So the question of why not the Sun Belt is, historians kind of get tripped up by counterfactuals, right? But it's an absolutely good question. If you have already left your home behind, if you've already migrated once, why not, and you wind up in Lawrence and then the jobs dry up, why not migrate again? And I think there's a couple different answers that, based on what I've seen, that I can give you, and none of them accounts for everyone, because people did it for different reasons. There are a lot of people who went to Lawrence and got stuck, who ultimately didn't. It cost a lot of money to migrate, and people who went to Lawrence wound up settling in the projects, dreamed of returning home, but never quite saved up enough money to return home. And certainly, if you don't have economic resources, moving to a place where you know no one, just because statistically you have a higher likelihood of getting a job there, is a real stretch, right? That would require a tremendous leap of faith. Another reason specifically is that a lot of people saw the fact that Lawrence was emptying out as an opportunity to build something. And so many people stayed there specifically to create a strong Latino community. And it became, it has absolutely, by the late 1990s, it had tremendous rates of Latino-owned small businesses. It had a tremendous bilingual, bicultural social service infrastructure. Many of the jobs in industry that had disappeared had been replaced by jobs in social services that required bilingual employees. Every place in Lawrence, effectively, to work in Lawrence, whether it's a bank, city hall, a hospital, requires bilingual employees. So the activism that was going on during the worst of the crisis also laid the groundwork for not quite an enclave economy, because that, in my mind, that implies a little bit more resources than what was happening, but a very grassroots, profoundly sustaining for many people who live there, economy, effectively. And there's a quote I have in there from someone who was named after the city. His name is Lawrence Garcia, and he was born in the city. His parents named him after the city, and he said, he's talking about the way that the city gets stigmatized in the surrounding region, and how it's talked about as the city of the damned, and how people talk about how they should just bomb it and start it over. And he says, but outsiders don't come in here to see what it's all about. This is the best town in the world for me. Right, so a place where in the region, it's one of the few places where Latino professionals could own their own home, and so that kept many people there. It's a place where if you wanted to start a Spanish language newspaper, it's an open field, right? And it's a place where these things that people started in the 80s and the early 90s were able to grow and flourish without gentrification. And I don't, in New York, it's we take for granted that everything is changing and people are getting pushed out, and everything that has been built, we are now saying goodbye to. Everything that was built in the earlier decades, we are watching evaporate in this onslaught of wealth that has come back and recolonized the city. And that simply hasn't happened in Lawrence. That what has been built in Lawrence since the 70s and the 80s is still being built in Lawrence. These organizations, these cultural celebrations that were started decades ago are still flourishing there. And so for some people, I believe that it's the sheer damage to the economy in the worst of the crisis years pinned people there. People certainly say, I would like to leave, but I can't. But I think also, I don't want to understate that for many people who stayed, it was a choice to stay, both because that's where their family was. They had reconstituted these extended family networks, and to move everyone would have been impossible, and so they stayed to be part of these communities. But I really think that the way that the city had been shaped to be a bilingual, bicultural city really inspires many of the people who live there. It is grassroots central in a lot of ways, and a lot of activists and organizers view the city as a model for how you can end crisis, because the city is not in a state of crisis anymore, how you can revitalize, how you can have a renaissance aside from gentrification, aside from this neoliberal model of attracting millionaires in. Lawrence is a model of how if you can invest in the people who are already there, if you can allow the people who already live in the city to really develop, and that's what activists had been fighting for since the 1950s, was city officials, city elites, stop trying to attract in wealthy people into the city. Instead, let us build, let us stay, take our voices seriously, invest in us. Rather than spending money on a marketing campaign to attract a white knight to the city, help give us loans so that we can buy houses and fix up the houses, right? And so this grassroots activism has really shaped the city in a way that many people are attached to.
And do your respondents articulate, do they verbalize these thoughts?
I mean, the fact, I asked, one of the main women that I focus on is a Puerto Rican woman named Isabel Melendez. And she came to the city in 1959, and she really has been in every major action or organization that I found in the archive. She was somewhere right in the middle of it. And she ran the Spanish Center for the Greater Lawrence Community Action Council for decades until she retired. She was the first Latina to win the Democratic primary for mayor. She didn't actually become mayor, but so a tremendously influential activist in the city. And I asked her, I said, why then, given that Lawrence doesn't actually provide job opportunities, economic opportunities, why are so many people still settling in the city? And she said, I go to Florida, I go to Dominican Republic, I go to Puerto Rico, I tell people it's not what it used to be. The rent is really high, because rent was always high relative to wages, even without gentrification. There's not a lot of jobs, it's not what it used to be, but people don't listen. I said, well, why don't they listen? She goes, I just think that if you want botanica, you've got one. If you want a Spanish language church, you've got one. If you want this, if you want that, if you want a Spanish restaurant, if you want a cultural celebration, if you want to see the best Guatemalan dancing in New England, Lawrence has all of that. They keep coming because it is a city that is thoroughly bilingual, that has a thoroughly bicultural social service sector, that has a thoroughly bilingual retail sector, a thriving downtown, in that sense, and that the space itself is a space where people feel at home. And yes, so people absolutely articulate that even without the job opportunities in a more traditional sense, that Lawrence provides opportunities because of what activists have created there.
I know you have another question pending, but if I may jump into this question. If I recall, I read a dissertation way back about Lawrence Holyoke, Lawrence.
Ramon Borges Mendez.
Oh yeah,
Mm-hmm.
well, go figure that out. And more recently, a colleague of ours wrote a piece about, sort of segmented suburbanization from New York more recently, because in those towns, the pattern was people coming from New York, right? But if I recall, in the narrative of the people that went at the time, right? There was this perception, you described the quality of life, pretty attractive and so forth. So for people that were here confronting drugs, and it was not just gentrification in traditional way, it was a push factor with criminal activity and drugs and people raising families, they wanted schools that were, more neighborhood oriented and that sort of segmented urbanization and going to these little towns provided an improvement in quality of life compared to this urban crisis that was pushing them out, right? So everything is relative. So, but even for the pioneers that went there, there's this narrative about improving their quality of life, even though they were still poor, even though they had sort of entry-level jobs or whatever you want to describe. But anyway,
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and really over and over again, what I saw in the interviews from people who went to Lawrence in the 60s, 70s, was over that they were looking for exactly that, tranquilidad. They were looking for a place where their kids could play in the street. They were looking for a place where they didn't have to worry about being mugged. They were looking for a place they didn't have to worry about their kids getting into drugs and gangs. They were then shocked and disappointed when Lawrence, by the 1980s, had entered into its own type of crisis, and then people describe trying to move again to South Florida, or wishing they could move but not having the resources, dreaming of moving. But again, you know, one of the things I try to emphasize, though, at least in the context of, again, these small New England cities, is that by 1990, only 39% of the Latino labor force in Lawrence worked in the city. Otherwise, they were either unemployed or they worked in the surrounding suburbs, which had become the major economic area. So the concentration of Latinos in the city itself is not just about jobs, it's not just about quality of life, because if your kids can play in the streets in Lawrence, they can definitely play in the streets in the neighboring Andover or North Andover or Methuen, the neighboring suburbs, right? It's not that ultimately this is also about the economics and the racism involved in segregation, that there was not, if they wanted to move near Lawrence, overwhelmingly Dominicans and Puerto Ricans in this era. It's changed a little bit since then, but in the 80s and the 70s, 80s, and 90s, if Dominicans and Puerto Ricans wanted to live in the New England region, they were going to wind up segregated within cities like Lawrence, Holyoke, Chelsea. It's not just about what pulled people towards the city, it's about what constrained them within municipal boundaries at the same time that the municipality was experiencing a fiscal crisis. And so segregation is a part of these stories to me. Sorry, I saw your hand in the back, yeah.
I came here a little bit late, so a little question out of curiosity. Can you make any comment with the comparisons of that particular state at that time in New York City? And two, how was the relationship between the Puerto Rican and Dominican community? Not in New York, in that area. Any comment regarding that?
Yeah, so in terms of the relationship between Dominicans and Puerto Ricans, I think I answered that right before you got in. But talking about how there was definitely some conflict, but also, you know, I privilege in the book the voice of activists and organizers who really emphasize that conflict was overblown, and that Latinos in the city actually had a lot more in common. Were speaking with a common voice in many of their demands in the city. And then in terms of comparisons with New York, Lawrence was experienced a very similar trajectory to New York, just on a slightly delayed time frame. So really, deindustrialization and urban crisis, fiscal crisis, didn't really hit Lawrence until the 1980s, whereas in New York, it really hit hard in the 1970s. So initially, when people left New York to go to Lawrence in the 70s, they experienced improved quality of life, a lot peaceful. They had, you know, higher wages, the median income was higher, but by the 1980s and the 1990s, that had completely reversed, and Lawrence had a much lower median income, much higher poverty rates, and people really complained that it didn't offer a positive quality of life relative to New York. One of the things that's most shocking, again, about these small cities in the Northeast is educational experiences, right? We expect that stateside or U.S.-born Dominicans and Puerto Ricans are going to do better than their migrant parents, better than their immigrant parents, right? But in many of these small cities, the reverse is actually true, that the second generation has lower incomes, lower rates of college graduation than the migrant generation. And that's, you know, in Lawrence, there's a study done in 2000 that for Dominican immigrants had a 6.6% bachelor's rate, 6.6% college graduation rate. But second generation Dominican Americans had a 2.2% college graduation rate. So you really see that even though Dominicans and Puerto Ricans have done a lot to revitalize the city during that crisis era, during this era where the backbone of the economy dropped out, and as a result the educational services were abysmal, 48 students in a classroom, kids standing up around the outside, not even having enough desks, sitting on the floor, borrowing textbooks from the suburban schools next door. that the Lawrence, in a state of crisis, didn't really provide opportunities for upward mobility for people who settled there. Yeah.
I'm interested in your connecting your study and narrative, the three themes in Lawrence to the experience of migration of Puerto Ricans and Dominicans to other cities, second tier, and it's specifically thinking of places like Allentown, Lancaster, Schenectady, Troy, Brentwood on Long Island, and what is similar or what is different about them. I know that the case of people moving to the Poconos or getting a house there and even coming back and forth to work, that's a completely different reality. But the presence in places like Rochester, Buffalo, are they similar? Because many of these are towns, Troy, Schenectady, that are part of that Rust Belt, loss of businesses and factories.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I mean, really, the history of studying, you know, there's been tremendous work done on the history of Dominican and Puerto Rican communities, and yet there has been the idea that we should study these communities within a larger urban political economy is really just developing. The understanding how the racialized metropolitan political economy of the second half of the 20th century impacted people's choices is still something that we're kind of working through. And so there are, you know, Brentwood is very different than Lawrence, and yet not, right? And in some ways it's very different. Brentwood is quite suburban. Brentwood is absolutely within within the greater New York area, and yet the level of stigmatization in Brentwood is shocking. The way that for people who live around Brentwood, if you say Brentwood, it is associated with criminality, it's associated with poverty, it's racialized and stigmatized in a way that profoundly resembles Lawrence. So I really, you know, I wish that I had more information for you about this, but this really, as historians, this work is just beginning, effectively.
And I'm asking the question in the context of the exodus of Puerto Ricans after Maria, and they're coming to parts of New York and other states, and I don't know if they're going to the Boston area or to towns like Lawrence or any others, but here we see more of them going to places like Rochester than to New York with its much larger Puerto Rican community.
I was just told that that Massachusetts, based on school attendance rating, is one of the top 3 new arrival sites for Puerto Ricans post-Maria. So, but where specifically in Massachusetts they're settling, I don't know yet. That's a great question.
Can you spend a little more time talking about the arts and culture that was a product of all this migration that was happening to Lawrence?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, there are certain, again, the archive that I was using is quite constrained. So there is a lot more that could be said than I am able to say. But one of the many ways that Dominicans and Puerto Ricans in the area claimed space, one of the many ways that people claim urban space, is through cultural celebration. So back in 1979, a number of organizers got together and they began Semana Hispana, which is a week-long celebration of all different Latin American nationalities and combined with distinctly U.S.-style Latino cultural celebrations, right? And there's a Guatemalan night, there's a Dominican night, there's Puerto Rican night, there's Cuban night, but then also this is all within the umbrella of this overarching Hispanic cultural celebration that really tries, and the kind of tagline is together in harmony, right? And so it's this idea that each individual nationality is going to be celebrated through dance, through music, through an array of different expositions, right? I go through, I have one chapter where I just kind of list, and then they performed, and then they performed, and it's tremendously exciting. And yet, although it's really focused on each nationality, the larger thing is for different nationalities to teach each other about their culture so that there can be this forged together in harmony, this forged pan-ethnic Latinidad, and specifically also to showcase the best of Latin American culture, the best of Latino culture to the white community. And activists constantly got frustrated that although they meant this to be a gift, an offering to their white neighbors of like, look at what beautiful culture Latin America has, look at what beautiful things Latinos have brought to your city, that they complained that white residents would never show up. And that there are a lot of these expressions of vibrancy that happened in the city were read by white residents in the city as further sign that the city had been taken over, that the city had been lost to them. And so this pan-ethnic celebration that really was meant to be a kind of this explosion of art and music and dance turned into, for many white people in and around the area, another sign that Lawrence was going downhill, effectively. Yeah?
I have a comment. As I remember in the 70s in Puerto Rico, when we tried to discuss these social inequalities, we were labeled as ungrateful communists who have been brainwashed, and it's amazing to see and hear young voices in pointing out these issues and creating this social awareness in this era, which is, I think, so very important again.
Thank you. Yeah, as Cecilia Marquez noted early on in her very nice comments, the part of what I'm trying to do in this book is to bring in voices of insurgent activism, people who organized, and people who organized through culture, people who organized through immigrant support networks, people who organized in very traditional ways, but also people who rioted, who said, no, this is my city and I'm not leaving. If you call me a spick again, I'm gonna throw a Molotov cocktail at you, right? People who insisted militantly, scrappily in the streets on their right to the city, and who then, when the press poured in to say, why is there a riot in Lawrence, really clearly articulated, this city doesn't give a about us. This city has marginalized us, and there are roaches crawling through the foods and the projects, and they lock us in the projects like cages, and the police abuse us, and we're angry, and we're disappointed, and we're raging. And that rage that was articulated in particularly in the 1980s is really something that is too often glossed over, I feel, in the current era, where people talk about, where is the anger? Where is the rage? And I personally feel as a historian that if you look back, there are this idea that Puerto Ricans and Dominicans are docile, or that Latinos are docile or politically apathetic. That idea just doesn't, to me, have any credence. Because if you look at the archive, what you see is over and over again, people, whether it's peacefully or whether it's with a Molotov cocktail, demanding on their rights to claim space here, on their rights to claim resources here, on their rights to have opportunities here. One of the early quotes says, I came to this country that I used, said, I came to this country for opportunities. This is supposed to be the land of opportunities. But what I see is that these opportunities aren't for everybody. And what it looks like is that we're going to have to fight for those opportunities. And he said, and believe me, if it comes to that, we're going to fight, right? A very outspoken insistence that this is not the America that we were promised. The opportunities here, the American dream, is really restricted based on race and class. And so these things that we thought we would achieve just by migrating, actually it looks like we're going to have to insist on, we're going to have to claim, we're going to have to fight for. And the Latinos in Lawrence absolutely organized, not everyone, but many of them organized to fight for these things. And that's, I was asked once when I talked about this research in Lawrence very early on, it was right after a really stigmatizing article had just come out calling Lawrence, again, the city of the damned. And a lot of the people who had come to hear this talk said, you know, we're just so tired of hearing our city talked about in this negative way. And we understand that, you know, you're talking about urban crisis, you're talking about a very specific economic transformation that happened, and that's real. She said, but can you tell us something good about the history of this city? Can you tell us something? When people say, oh, Lawrence, the city of the damned, can you give us something from this history that we can answer back? And my answer was that everything that exists in Lawrence has been fought for. Everything, the every bilingual signs in the park, the fact that you can go to a doctor's office and speak Spanish and still get adequate medical care, that was fought for. For a while, that didn't even exist in the city. They didn't even have interpreters in the courts. There was a case in 1970 where a man was accused of a crime, and the person accusing him interpreted for him, translated for him in court, and he was convicted. Surprise, right? And so everything, the most basic things in the city were not just about a demographic transformation. It wasn't just that Latinos got there and so then the city got different, right? It was everything positive in the city was fought for, either through organizing or through just quotidian acts of insisting on their right to be in the city.
While you rightly describe the fact that since the African American population in Lawrence was so small, the racialization of the urban crisis in Lawrence, well, there was an absence of a black population by and large. It was racialized, you know, around Latinos, Hispanics. But it is a particular segment of the Hispanic population. It is the Hispanic population that has the greatest percentage and presence of African descent. And aside from Panamanians that have the highest percentage of African and self-identified blacks, you know, they are Puerto Ricans and Dominicans. So it is not completely absent that you have a black-white dynamic at play in Lawrence. And I wonder how that black-white dynamic, black in reference to these Caribbean migrants and immigrants, played out to degrade them even further because they are foreign blacks.
Yeah, it's a great question, and of course the reality of the African descent of Puerto Ricans and Dominicans impacts their racialization not just in Lawrence, but in New York and nationally, right? And so that's absolutely correct and an important point and an important thing to keep in mind. And yet the other thing that's interesting to me is the way that during the crisis era, Mexican-American communities, Chicano communities, if they were urban, were stereotyped and stigmatized in very similar ways as being criminals, as being gang members, as being welfare abusers. And these anti-black stereotypes were recycled not just with Dominicans and Puerto Ricans, people who had often large proportions of African descent, right? But also with any group that was a group of color that was stigmatized as inner city. And this is true, again, even of Cambodians, even of Hmong refugees, right? This is true of immigrants of color, refugees of color, who were poor or working class, who were concentrated in inner cities during the crisis era. You know, racial discourses are flexible. They represent a flexible arsenal that people can apply at will, and they are damaging whatever direction they are pointed at, right? And so it's interesting. You know, during the 80s and the 90s, there was this obsessive concern with the Puerto Rican underclass, right? And that was sometimes expanded to concerns about Dominican underclass or Chicano underclass, but definitely an obsessive concern with a Puerto Rican underclass. And yet, in 2018, that idea of a welfare-reliant underclass of permanently poor and unemployed has been replaced with a preoccupation about Latinos as workers, whether it's a positive, hardworking immigrant narrative or whether it's a they take our job narrative. The last 20 years have shifted the discourse about Latinos away from this this urban crisis era narrative of the underclass. And so for me, that's one of the things that's really different about the crisis era, is that it created this discourse of an inner city urban underclass and created a national preoccupation. You know, this idea of the criminal immigrant is persistent and quite viciously deployed in the present moment. But that idea emerged in the crisis era. That idea emerged in response to ideas about the inner city underclass. And so that idea, it has persisted in the current era, but it emerged from this underclass urban crisis era. And so for me as a historian, to understand the current moment, we have to go back and understand, well, how is it that people who are on the one hand in trouble for taking all the jobs are also discursively constructed as criminal underclass, right? That parallel and logically irreconcilable discourse has its origins in the urban crisis. So until we unpack what Latino experiences were with that crisis, we can't really understand its ramifications in terms of the entire creation of immigrant detention before deportation is also a result of this crisis era, right? And so these things that exist in the present moment were forged in an era where inequality was profoundly spatialized. And then that spatialization of inequality was discursively justified by all these narratives and stories about the inner city. And if you were a person of color living in the inner city, if you were a community of color living in the inner city, that have impacted that community, right, in a way that we're still kind of unpacking decades later. Any other questions? Well, thank you so much for coming. Thank you. Thank you so much.
That's fun. So I was starting to hear you talk about it.
And for you, what's in it?
Do I talk about it different each time
You
you
don't
hear it,
feel
or
it?
just like the same?
You're used to
No,
it.
it does change every time.
You don't like those, you don't worry.